Is it working today? Okay. I think I changed it to where you had to request to get it, send it back to you. So I don't know what that looks like. All right, guys. Today we're going to keep talking about growth promotants. We're going to focus on ionophores first and then switch gears to beta agonists. Okay. So one thing from the previous lecture that I don't think I did a good enough job making explicitly clear are what implant strategies can be reimplanted. And so really it comes down to five, okay? Here, I'll let you get the quiz. So you can start out with Synovex C, followed by Synovex S 70 days later. You can start out with Synovex S, followed by Synovex S 70 days later. You can start with Synovex Choice, and then followed by Synovex Choice. Start with Synovex Choice, then go to Synovex Plus. Start with Synovex Choice, and go to Synovex 1 feedlot. So any other reimplant regimens are technically off-label. Not saying they're not necessarily being done, though. Okay. So today, I want you guys to know the general mode of action for ionophores. We're not going to go too specific, but just kind of know high level, general, how they work. Okay. I want you to be able to explain the classic response of cattle to ionophores when they're on a high roughage or a finishing diet. Okay. Know the two, really, I guess there's technically three commercially available, but there's ractopamine hydrochloride. Optiflex was the original. Actigain, but through Zoetis is the generic. And then Lubabergon, so that's Experior. Technically, Zilmax, zolpidary hydrochloride, is still labeled. However, it was voluntarily pulled from the market. Okay. Why might one feed yard use one of these beta agonists over the other? And I would say when we look at the classic or the typical response to these beta agonists in today's context of, Experior versus Optiflex or Actigain, it's really not even close. Okay. What is the most recent beta agonist labeled for? Okay. So be able to describe that distinction, why it's important. All right. What are the target receptors for these two beta agonists? Kind of general, how do they work? What is uh, the growth rate and carcass response to feeding beta agonists? Okay. All right, so starting off with ionophores. So we've got Maninsin, so that's trade named Rumensin through Elanco. I think there's a generic through Hupharma. Not very many people are feeding it though. There's Lasalicid, it's trade names Bovatec. Laedomycin, trade name Catalyst. So these are technically antibiotics, okay? However, they're not medically important to humans, so you do not need a VFD or veterinary feed directive, okay? So ionophores, just in general, they disrupt the sodium-potassium homeostasis and result in changes in cytosolic pH of bacteria, okay? So ion and phore means ion carrier in Greek. So that alludes to directly how they function. Okay. So importantly, ionophores are lipid soluble, so they can associate with bacterial lipid bilayers, cell membranes. Okay. Um, and ionophores bind to a metal ion, so sodium, potassium, transported across the cell membrane. Okay. Then they dissociate from that metal ion. So, for example, Maninsin transports sodium into the cell and then transports potassium outside of the cell. Okay. The ionophore is then, once it's dissociated and switched back to the outside of the cell, it can transport more minerals. Okay. So it's not kind of a one and done type thing. So the bacteria must pump in uh, potassium and pump out sodium, and they do that through an energy facilitated transporter. So they exhaust up their ATP to maintain their homeostasis, and it eventually kills the cell. Okay. Um, so there's some good references. Russell and Strobel in 1989 proposed this mode of action, and I think it pretty well stands true today. Okay. So Jim Russell's he's a famous microbiologist, ruminant microbiologist. Uh, you'll see his name quite a bit if you continue on in the ruminant nutrition space. So importantly, ionophores are specific to gram-positive bacteria. Okay, by killing gram-positive bacteria, which are more acetogenic. Okay, they allow gram-negative bacteria to proliferate. Okay, these gram-negative bacteria are more prone to produce propionate. Okay, propionate, so acetate, propionate, butyrate, isobutyrate, isovalerate, all these are volatile fatty acids, right? Okay. You guys should know that, I think. Okay. So propionate is more energetically efficient to the animal than acetate, right? So propionate can be converted to oxalyl acetate and directly enter into the TCA cycle to yield ATP. Okay. Acetate, to enter into the TCA cycle, needs to condense with oxalyl acetate. Okay. And so uh, uh, oxalyl acetate derived from propionate as probably the major source in ruminants. Other sources are glucogenic amino acids, lactate, and glycerol. Okay, so glycerol are the backbones of fatty acids or triglycerides. So if oxalyl acetate is limited uh, through limited propionate production, then more acetate gets catabolized for energy by conversion into ketone bodies. So that's a less energetically favorable uh, means of metabolizing these volatile fatty acids for energy. Does that make sense? So that's kind of why acetate's less energetically favorable than propionate. Okay. So importantly, ionophores are toxic to horses. Okay. Has anyone heard of Butler and Sons in Elk City? Yeah. They lost around 70 horses to contaminated feed they bought from Livestock Nutrition Council. Again, not to talk bad about LNC, but they kind of pop up in a lot, and you hear these types of F-ups. Uh, so yeah, this company's bred and raised horses since 1929. Uh, yeah, so especially like pen riders on a feed yard need to be real careful what feed gets fed to their horses, right? They kill cattle. Interesting. Somebody did mess up like grams, kilograms, or something like that. I have no idea. Yeah. There are people wondering if LNC will eventually be Butler and Sons feed company or something, but they did get a I bet so. Yeah. All right. So to really understand how ionophores uh, cause the effect that we see in animals, we need to understand intake regulation. Okay. Have you guys talked about intake regulation in cattle? In feeds and feeding? Okay. I think maybe next year I'll have a lecture on that much earlier. Um, basically, uh, this is the NASM equation to predict intake. Okay. So dry matter intake as a percent of body weight is a function of NEM. Okay. And it has a quadratic response. All right. It peaks. So this table is calculating based off a 1,000-pound beast. Okay. You see a peak in dry matter intake at around 60% TDN. So that's 60 megacals NEM per hundredweight. 34 megacals at NEG per hundredweight. Okay. So there's still a lot of debate on intake regulation in ruminants. Many theories exist. So there's biphasic regulation, which is what this model is probably most uh, uh, typically following, right? Where we see it increase, and then something changes in how that animal is regulating intake, and you start seeing intake decrease as energy intake goes up. Okay. There's the minimal total discomfort theory. So that's saying that cattle will consume feed to balance out the uh, or to a state that minimizes their discomfort. Okay. So it's trying to unify all these different theories. Okay. There's hepatic oxidation. So that's saying cattle will eat feed until fuels produced in the liver cause some kind of signaling that tells the animal to stop. Okay. And there's several others. So the biphasic theory is widely taught, and it's kind of makes people that are proponents of other theories of intake really angry, right? So reviewed a paper for a guy who was basically trashing the biphasic intake regulation theory and said that there's no indication that that it's true, right? However, we kind of know that maybe it's not specifically true, but it fits pretty well, right? So that's why this NEM equation was generated in NASM, right? So basically, the biphasic theory on intake regulation states that as diet quality, digestibility, energy increases, dry matter intake will increase. Okay. During this period where dry matter intake is increasing, this will be typically on higher roughage diets. Okay. At this point, dry matter intake is mainly regulated by gastrointestinal fill. Okay. Uh, Physical gut distension. Right. So as digestibility increases, that animal is able to consume more feed because that fill passes out of the rumen quicker, breaks down quicker. Okay. Um, at some level of digestibility, as digestibility keeps increasing or energy keeps increasing, dry matter intake starts getting depressed. So the biphasic theory would say that at this point, intake regulation switches from gastrointestinal fill related to some chemotaxis signaling. Okay. Um, for example, this chemotaxis signaling could be propionate content in the bloodstream. Okay. Could be osmotic pressure in the rumen. Could be uh, uh, a number of other things, but ultimately they're saying that this chemotaxis regulation is starting to cause malaise to that animal. So think, and when intake is increasing with energy digestibility, think you're eating a salad, so you're eating until your gut's full. If at the other part of the graph, think, okay, I'm eating ice cream, I'm not eating till I'm full, I'm eating till I feel sick, right? Does that make sense? You're experiencing malaise. Okay. And I will say that when you supply exogenous propionate to the rumen, right, you will suppress intake. So that kind of supports this biphasic theory. However, it also kind of supports the hepatic oxidation theory. Okay. We won't go too much more into that. So, as mentioned previously, ionophores increase propionate and decrease acetate production. Okay. So classically in high roughage diets where intake is limited by gut fill, okay, when we feed monensin or ionophores in general, propionate increases. That propionate's more energetically favorable, so average daily gain increases. Okay. However, because intake is limited by gut fill, we're not going to see a response in dry matter intake. Okay. Gut fill is still limiting intake. However, that feed that's consumed produces more propionate, more energetically favorable, increases average daily gain. Make sense? In a high concentrate diet where intake is regulated chemostatically, propionate production, feeding Meninsin increases propionate. Okay. So the threshold of propionate production that limits intake is achieved at lower dry matter intakes. Okay. So we don't really see an average daily gain response, but we do see dry matter intake decreases. Does that make sense? Okay. So in both of these scenarios, feed to gain's reduced. Okay. In reality, so this is the classic response. In reality, it's a little more nuanced than that, but that's kind of what I would expect you to know the response for a test. Okay. Any questions on that? Cool. Okay, so Rumensin is labeled to be fed to growing cattle on pasture to improve feed efficiency at 50 to 200 milligrams per head per day. Okay, so this meta-analysis by Shane Gadberry looked at 38 different experiments, and they conducted, so all these studies were conducted with stalker cattle on pasture. The average Meninsin dose was 150 milligrams per head per day. So they saw that feeding Meninsin increased average daily gain by 0.15 pounds per head per day, or excuse me, 0.17 pounds per head per day, and increased final body weight of those animals by 23 pounds. Okay. So in this experiment, they also investigated bloat, benefits of feeding Meninsin to bloat. So they had 12 experiments where cattle were grazed on bloat-prone pastures, so mainly wheat. Okay. Why would wheat be prone to causing bloat? Anybody know? Okay. Wheat is high in soluble proteins. These soluble proteins in the rumen, when they get solubilized into the rumen, they create a foam. So it causes what's known as frothy bloat. Make sense? Okay. So a lot of that foam is created by gram-positive bacteria. Rumensin reduces gram-positive bacteria, so suppresses the formation of that frothy bloat. Okay. Um, the average Meninsin dose in those 12 studies was 238 milligrams per head per day. So some of those animals were getting over labeled. Okay. Um, so feeding Meninsin reduced the incidence of bloat by 20%. It also reduced severity by 0.7 bloat score units. Okay. All right. So study by my dad did a 3x2 factorial. Okay. They had in the stalker phase, no Meninsin offered through a loose mineral or a mineral block containing Meninsin. Okay. Um, then those cattle were either implanted or not. Okay. So they grazed 360 head on winter wheat at 1 steer per acre. They found that providing Meninsin increased average daily gain by 0.15 to 0.2 pounds per day. Okay. So that's compared to the no Meninsin, no implant treatment. Implanting steers increased average daily gain by 0.31 pounds per day. So there was no interaction, no significant interaction between those two factors. So graduate students, what does an interaction in our statistical model tell us?
of the effects because it's being influenced by statistically influenced by another one. So when you have that interaction, you have to kind of see what that interaction is. explain, can't explain without involving the other.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Maybe a more simplistic explanation would be um, if there's a significant interaction, the effect of one of your factors isn't consistent across the other factor, right? Does that make sense? So these were in pastures. So, affect supplement intake. So the supplement, the mineral supplement in these studies all contained, well, except for the control, would have had a loose mineral without monensin. Typically, yes, monensin inclusion can be used as an intake limiter. Okay.
Like low intake supplement, like for example, some mineral
Yep.
because the taste is not good and the animal realize that. And anyways, and cardio, it didn't work, at least in Brazil.
Mm.
So for low intake supplements like mineral, we just switch the type of ion.
Okay. Yeah. So monensin has been used as a limiter, similar like we discussed salt. Okay. But also similar to salt, you can balance the inclusion of monensin in that supplement with your desired intake level. Does that make sense? So you can theoretically achieve the same intake of monensin, say you're targeting 200 milligrams per head per day, by uh, at lower supplement intakes if you include monensin at a higher level. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes, there's a challenge if the supplement intake not what it's supposed to be. We're gonna have a supplementation of mineral levels and supplement those.
Yeah. The commercially available minerals are pretty dialed in on monensin uh, inclusion and uh, targeted intake. Um, yeah. So we've always had success feeding monensin through a loose mineral, 2 ounces to 4 ounces per head per day. Yeah. Um, so no interaction between monensin and implants. So the providing monensin and implants were additive. Okay. So stacking these technologies increased average daily gain by 22%, right? So that's half a pound per head per day. Okay. And it reduced cost of gain by 26%. Okay. So a meta-analysis done in confined feeding cattle, Duffield and others in 2012, conducted with data collected from 2017 to the 2010s, okay, or 1970 through the 2010s. So all trials were conducted in confined feeding. Some were growing diets, some were finishing. When they used the full data set, monensin reduced dry matter intake by 3%, increased average daily gain by 2.5%, and so reduced feed to gain by 6.4%. So I just previously mentioned there's no effect of monensin on average daily gain in feedlot cattle, but keep in mind the full data set included backgrounders. Okay. When you looked at data from just the US and recent data, basically all finishing diets, okay, the response of monensin to dry matter intake was 3% reduction, had no change in average daily gain, and reduced feed to gain by about 3.5%. Okay. So that's probably more classic of the response that we'd previously mentioned. So it kind of appears that the benefit of average daily gain in a confined feeding system, I mean, likely some of that's going to be confounded by energy content of the diet and what is regulating intake, but it also appears to disappear at modern fast growth rates. So maybe they saw a benefit in average daily gain in the 70s. We're not seeing that in more modern data. Okay. Okay, so a 3% reduction in dry matter intake and feed to gain seems small, but I would say that a small number times a large number is a large number, okay? So for example, say without Meninson, a steer would consume 25 pounds of dry matter per day, okay? So with Meninson, that steer would consume 3% less, or 24.25 pounds per day. So that's 3/4 of a pound per day less than non-Meninson fed cattle. So it would take 150 pounds less, pounds of dry matter less per head over a 200-day feeding trial period. Excuse me. So let's say that we have a feed yard that finishes 50,000 head of cattle a year. Okay. 150 times 50,000, save around 7.5 million pounds of feed for that feed yard a year. Okay. So in this scenario, a feed yard that finishes 50,000 head would have a 40,000 head capacity, one-time capacity. Okay. And 33,000 head on feed at any one given time. Okay. Does that make sense? So that's assuming that 200 divided by 365 is around 1.5 turns of cattle each year. And then the 25-year long-term average is feed yards are running at 83% capacity. Okay. So 33,000 head on feed at one time, that's termed occupancy. Okay. Capacity is if that feed yard was totally full, how many head could it support? And then they're finishing 50,000 head a year. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's assume 10 cents a pound dry matter. That would save that feed yard $750,000 a year, okay, by a 3% reduction in dry matter intake and feed to gain, right? So Meninson costs 2 cents per head per day, okay, times 50,000 times 200 days. So that Meninson would cost them around $200,000 a year to feed. So 750 minus 200,000 is 550,000 advantage for that large feed yard feeding Meninson. Make sense? So 3% reduction in dry matter intake, saving $500,000. Okay. So maybe a simpler approach that we could do to arrive at the benefits of feeding Meninson that you could sit down and run through with a producer when you're talking to them. So let's say that we start a steer at 800 pounds. We're going to finish that steer at 1,500. They're going to gain 3.5 pounds a day, consuming 25 pounds per day. So if they were not fed Meninson, they would have a feed to gain of 7.14. Okay. That's pretty typical of a Midwestern feed yard. Okay. With Meninson, steers are still gaining that 3.5 pounds a day. But now they're consuming 24.25 pounds of dry matter. So they would have a feed to gain of 6.93. All right. So again, 10 cents per pound of dry matter feed cost just for the scenario. So without Meninson, the feed cost of gain would be $71 per hundredweight. So 0.1, excuse me. Yeah, 0.1 times 7.14 times 100. Okay. With Meninson, your feed only cost of gain would be $69 per hundredweight. So 71 minus 69 is $2. So there's a $2 feed cost of gain per hundredweight advantage by feeding Meninson. So they gained 700 weights during that finishing trial. $2 times 700 weights is $14 per head saved. Okay. $71 times 7. So another way we could do this, $71 times 700 weight gained, total feed cost per head is $497 for that animal to be fed throughout the whole finishing period. Okay. Without Meninson. 69 times 7 is 483. Okay. So with Meninson, it costs that animal $483 to be fed for that 200-day period. Okay. $4.97 minus $4.83 is also $14. Are you guys following this? Okay. So 700 pounds gained divided by 3.5 is 200 days on feed times 2 cents cost of Meninson per head per day. It's going to cost you $4 per head to feed Meninson. Okay. 14 minus 4 is $10 per head. Okay. 10 times that's $10 per head return over the cost of Meninson. So 10, let's say you have a small feed yard with 1,000 animals. Okay. 10 times 1,000 is $10,000 per year to that small feed yard operation. At a large feed yard, 50,000, that'd be $500,000. Okay. So small benefits times large numbers are big benefits. Does it make sense?
Dr. Beck,
Yep.
if I did, when you think about operational, we can save wagon travels to feed the cattle, but plus you manage much less amount of feed, which means if we have an economy of 150 pounds per steer for the whole cycle of 200 days. And it means we can, for each 166 animals, we save one truck of feed, buying a truck.
Yep.
Truck. Just an amount, general amount of feed. So you can just project for the whole capacity of the feed yard.
Yep.
It's a lot.
It's a lot.
It's basically one truck less per pen.
Yeah.
Per cycle. It's a lot.
Yep. Makes sense. Cool. Yep. So this type of math is important to do if you're going to consult or talk with producers. The ability to sit down, pull out your phone, and crunch these numbers real fast to demonstrate to them the benefit of feeding Meninson can be important, right? Gains trust, makes it seem like you know what you're doing, even if you don't. Make sense? Cool. So let's say we're a custom feeding operation and we're making money by marking up feed costs. Okay. Why would we want to feed Meninson in a custom feeding system? It's reducing intake. We have a potential to sell less feed. Would we still want to feed Meninson?
Your customers probably demand that you feed Robinson. They're paying.
It's a good point. Probably feeding it to retain customers. Yeah, that's a good point. Anyone think of any other benefits of Meninson that we talked with stocker cattle? Lower bloat, lower risk of bloat, health management. We talked about that Meninson can modulate feed intake. Okay, so can we stop cattle from having gorging meals and entering into cycles of low pH, variability in day-to-day intake, ease of managing feed bunks? Okay, so I'd say all those are true, but also you're going to mark up your supplement. Your Meninson containing supplement is going to be marked up. Okay, so it's a trick question maybe. But yep, so other benefits, adds safety, again, protects against bloat. I did not go back and fill in that X, what percent of cattle are killed by bloat each year, but that's going to be in that NAHMS survey, USDA NOMS. So in the study by Dr. Galen Erickson at Nebraska, they showed that feeding Meninson decreased intake rate by 6.4%. Okay, increased the number of meals that those animals are having by 10.7%. Stabilized rumen pH, so decreased ruminal pH variance by 21%. So that's likely a factor of them spreading their meals throughout the day instead of going to the bunk and having a gorging meal, driving rumen pH down. Okay. So in essence, by modulating feed intake patterns, we are decreasing the likelihood of those cattle developing ruminal acidosis, subacute or acute ruminal acidosis, and bloat. Okay. Also, likely makes cattle consume feed more consistently from day to day. So again, avoids gorging, malaise, low feed, gorging cycles. Okay. So decreases your variation day-to-day intake, which is going to increase ease of bunk management. Make sense? But ultimately, you're right. They're going to feed Meninsin to retain customers. Okay. All right. So importantly, will feeding Rumensin, it's an antibiotic. What if these bacteria, if we feed this antibiotic through that animal's life, is there potential that those bacteria will start getting AMR, antimicrobial resistance? Well, Weiss, one of my dad's students, did a study in 2020. He conducted a 3x2 factorial. So cattle were fed in the growing phase, either 0, 100, or 200 milligrams of Meninsin per head per day. These cattle were fed either hay, they either grazed wheat or Bermuda grass pastures. Okay. Then they followed these cattle through finish where they were either fed Meninsin or not. Okay. So feeding Meninsin in the growing phase improved average daily gain by 9%. Okay. So 0.2 pounds per head per day. Pretty consistent with that meta-analysis we looked at. Okay. Improved final body weights by 7.5 pounds. Okay. So you could do 7.5 divided by 0.2 and you can know the average number of days those cattle were grown. Okay. There was no interaction between stalker Meninsin treatment and finisher Meninsin treatment. So as we talked about with interactions, that would indicate that feeding Meninsin in the stalker grower phase did not affect the response to Meninsin in the finisher phase. Okay. So in the finisher phase, feeding Meninsin had no effect on final body weight, average daily gain, or hot carcass weight. So that fits with the classic model. But it reduced dry matter intake by 5% and reduced feed to gain by 6%. So that fits really well with the classic response that we talked about previously. Okay? Make sense? That's just the 3% came from a meta-analysis summarizing 38 experiments. Or, no, that was the Duffield one. A lot of experiments. This is just from one experiment. So that 3% is likely the more accurate number. These cattle just responded a little bit better for whatever reason. DMI will classically not decrease in the grower stalker phase, but average daily gain will increase. DMI classically will only decrease in the finisher on a high energy diet where intake is regulated by propionate production, right? And by Meninsin increasing propionate at the expense of acetate, they reach that threshold of propionate production that suppresses intake at a lower intake level. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Switching gears. Yes. Mm, I guess the age would be whatever age they're willing to go and eat the mineral or supplement, because you can feed it to a cow-calf sector with calves on the side, right? Oh, yeah. Yeah, I don't know on the dairy side if they're going to give Meninsin in the hutch or not. I don't know.
For beef steers or calves, actually, there are studies showing that monitoring in quick feeding systems can have that coccidiostatic effect.
Oh, yep.
So reduce the diarrhea, and diarrhea is the main cause of that.
the reason these were first labeled was because they're coccidiostats in poultry. They just happen to also increase feed efficiency. Yeah, that's a good point. Another benefit of feeding it to cattle, right? Especially receiving cattle into a feed yard, where they would be stressed and more likely to uh, exhibit the effects of coccidiosis. Yep. Okay, switching over to beta agonists, which I will go ahead and say that we should really be calling beta ligands now because of Experior, right? So, but everyone's still going to call it beta agonists. So, okay. Most of this information I'm getting from Dilger and others in 2021. Okay. Brad Johnson at Texas Tech is on this paper, and then some Lanco employees. But you can see the chemical structure of these different beta agonists, right? So it was a surprise to me when my daughter got RSV and I gave her a nebulizer from the doctor. It contains a beta agonist, right? What's that?
Albuterol.
Yeah, albuterol. That's the one. So they are medically important, right? But they're not antibiotics. Okay. So they do not require a VFD. So beta adrenergic receptor ligands are what these should really be called now, because Experior is an agonist and an antagonist. So ligands mean that they bind to a receptor and cause some effect. Okay. Agonist means they bind to the receptor and activate the receptor. Um, and so the agonists are beta adrenergic agonists. Okay. Antagonist means they bind to the receptor and block its activity. Okay. These would also be termed beta blockers, right? So there are 3 approved beta agonists by the FDA that can be fed to cattle. Okay. Ractopamine hydrochloride. Okay. It has a agonistic effect on beta 1 and 2 receptors. So trade name Actigain, which should be the generic sold by Zoetis, and Optiflex should be 2 X's there at the end of Optiflex, sold by Elanco. Then we have zolpadrol hydrochloride, okay, has an agonistic effect on beta 1 and beta 2 receptors as well. Trade name Zilmax was sold by Merck. However, they've pulled it from the market, at least in the US. I think they're still selling it in Mexico and maybe other countries. Then now the most recent one we have is lubabragon fumarate, okay, has an agonistic effect on beta 3 receptors and an antagonistic effect on beta 1 and 2. So it's the first drug in its class, technically, okay? The FDA has labeled it as a beta adrenergic agonist / antagonist, okay? It's marketed as Experior through Elanco. Any questions? Okay, let's go into some history, all right? So beta agonists have been researched for their potential to improve animal feed efficiency for a long time, since the late 1970s, maybe even earlier, okay? Ractopamine hydrochloride was first approved to be fed in pigs in 1999, was approved to be fed in cattle in 2003, in turkeys in 2008, okay? Zilpadrol hydrochloride, trade name Zilmax, was approved to be fed to cattle in 2006. And then more recently, lubabragon was approved by FDA for cattle in 2008. Okay. So, some more history. Zilpadrol hydrochloride was voluntarily pulled from the market on August 16th, 2013. Okay. So Tyson, which harvests around 25% of the cattle slaughtered in the U.S., of the fed cattle slaughtered in the U.S., termed one of the big 4, Okay. They cited that cattle with ambulatory issues in their holding pens were occurring, and they linked this to Zilmax. Okay. Importantly, they did not link it using science or actually investigating true associations, right? Or true statistical correlations or relationships, but they just did it based off association. I think most of these ambulatory issues were coming out of Idaho and probably occurring because of poor pen conditions and their negative effects on feet, right? So within 10 days of Tyson saying they wouldn't take any cattle fed Zilmax, Merck decided to pull Zilmax from the market. Within a few weeks, Cargill, JBS, and National Beef announced that they would also stop taking cattle that were fed Zilmax. Okay, so those are the four big producers collectively, or packers collectively. They represent around 80% of cattle slaughtered in the U.S. So when they say they're not going to take your product, you don't have a market. Even if Merck would sell that Zilmax, you wouldn't have a market or an outlet for those cattle. Now, a lot of people speculate that this response by Tyson was more related to trying to get producers to stop feeding beta agonists, okay, so that they could sell more meat to China, because China put a ban on importing meat fed beta agonists, okay? That's speculation, okay? All right, some history, Experior. So Lubabergon fumarate, approved by the FDA in 2018. It is only labeled for the reduction of ammonia gas emissions per pound of body weight and hot carcass weight. Okay, it is not labeled for benefits to feed efficiency, increasing hot carcass weight, increasing final body weight. Right. So basically, all growth promotants are going to reduce ammonia emissions because they're increasing nitrogen retention through protein. So do we think that Lubabergon is special in that potential benefit to reduce ammonia emissions? Or do we think Optiflex would also reduce ammonia emissions? I would say, yeah. Implants are going to reduce ammonia emissions. Anything that's increasing nitrogen retention and nitrogen use efficiency will limit nitrogen excretions in feces and urine. So less manure nitrogen, less manure ammonia. Make sense? Okay. So according to Rinker in 2024, this paper, which he's an employee of Elanco, I think he probably headed up the development of Lubabergon. He even says this novel claim was pursued due to anticipated external pressure on animal health products carrying an only performance-based claims, right? So they wanted to help bridge the gap between the overarching desire for sustainable agriculture and the use of technologies. So reading between the lines, they went through the ammonia reduction label with the FDA because, I mean, you think about who was president in 2018, right? They thought they could get it through faster if they had an environmental claim, right? And it did. It worked. So I would say read the rest of that paper, the Rinker paper. It's really interesting how Lubabergon was first developed, Eli Lilly, human health, and then when they found that it was limited in its benefits for humans, switched it to Elanco, the Eli Lilly animal health company, right? Cool. So, diet inclusion for Zilmax. I'm going to just keep Zilmax here because it's interesting. It's a heck of a drug, okay? So diet inclusion of Zilmax is limited to 6.8 grams per ton of feed. For Optiflex, 9.8 to 24.6. For Experior, 1.25 to 4.54. Okay. Feeding rate, so in milligrams per head per day. For Zilmax, 60 to 90. For Optiflex, 90 to 430. For Experior, 13 to 90. Called and talked with Axel Weissman, beef cattle technical consultant for Elanco. He's now actually with PMS Midwest. But he said typically people are feeding Optiflex at around 300 milligrams per head per day and feeding Experior at 36 milligrams per head per day. Okay. Feeding duration, that's approved range for Zilmax, 20 to 40, the last 20 to 40 days on feed. For Optiflex, the last 28 to 42 days on feed. For Experior, last 41 to 91. Feeding duration, 28 to 35. And this is the typical. So for Optiflex, they're typically feeding at 28 to 35 days on feed, 40 to 45 days on feed for Experior. Zilmax had a 3-day withdrawal time. The rest of these do not have a withdrawal time. Okay. So typical response, okay, for Zilmax and ractopamine, I took some of these responses from a meta-analysis published in 2014. For Experior, I basically collated the data from the 6 experiments that are available with Experior, okay? So Experior is going to be pretty well dialed on to the best of our knowledge and the best that the current data in the literature has to offer. Zilmax and Optiflex are going to be limited to the accuracy of that meta-analysis. And then some of these I had to fill in based off of a presentation given by Casey Maxwell, okay? So Zilmax will reduce dry matter intake around 0.35 pounds per day, will increase average daily gain by almost a half a pound per day during that period that it's being fed. This is not over the whole feeding period, okay? Will reduce feed to gain by 2.3 pounds of feed per pound of gain, okay? Will increase final body weight by 14.5 pounds, will increase hot carcass weight by 34 pounds. That's crazy, right? The increase in hot carcass weight isn't necessarily the same increase that we're seeing in live weight. So we're seeing a huge increase in our dressing percent, 1.7 percentage units increase. Okay, you'll see a relatively large reduction in marbling score. Around 8% of that group of cattle will grade choice and prime, and then you'll see yield grade will decrease, so improve by 0.35 yield grade units. Okay. Optiflex will have a more limited effect on dry matter intake, will increase average daily gain by almost half a pound a day, will decrease feed to gain by 1 pound of feed per pound of gain, will increase body weight by 15 pounds, okay, and increase hot carcass weight by 16 pounds. So it has more of a limited benefit on dressing percent, okay, has a less impact on marbling, and a less impact on yield grade. Now, Experior is somewhere in the middle of a response between Zilmax and Optiflex. Okay, no real impact on dry matter intake. Will increase average daily gain by about 0.42. Reduce feed to gain. Increase final body weight by 26 pounds. Increase hot carcass weight by 29. Increase dressing percentage by 1 percentage unit. Reduce marbling, but only about 4% less cattle will grade choice and prime, and then reduce yield or reduce the yield grade value or improve yield grade. Yep. Yeah, I think it's from the location and the pen conditions that those cattle were coming from. Yeah, is the rumor I've heard. Coming out of Idaho, coming out of the winter, wet pens. Wet pens are bad for feed. Yep. So looking at this, if we were able to feed Zilmax, would you want to market those cattle in the beef or on a carcass basis or on a live basis? In the beef, always. Yep, because most of that increase is occurring in carcass. If you're selling them on a live basis, you'd only see a 14-pound advantage, right? Okay.
Should we use this for just that certain period, not more than that?
Well, that's what it's labeled for. So, and if you use it for too long, so you'll see most people aren't feeding at the upper end of what it's labeled for. If you feed it for too long, you see no real benefits in necessarily hot carcass weight, but continued reductions in marbling. Okay. So, mode of action. I think I've got 18 minutes. No, 10 minutes, 8 minutes. Okay. Ractopamine and zilpaterol, agonist for beta 1 and beta and 2. Lubabergon, agonist for beta 3. So, this diagram would show the mode of action for these, for beta 1 and beta 2, and for lubabergon for beta 3. Without, importantly, lubabergon's not going to have a lipogenesis or effect on lipolysis. Okay. So once the compound's at its action site, beta agonistic, the beta agonist binds to the beta adrenergic receptor, which causes conformational change of the membrane-bound receptor. It activates this GS protein, so this GTP binding protein, activates adenyl cyclase to produce cyclic AMP, which activates protein kinase A. This triggers a phosphorylation of intracellular proteins / enzymes, which lead to these metabolic modifications. Okay? Maybe don't need to know all that. Maybe just know which beta receptors they act on. Okay? All right, lubabergon. So most of this is summarized out of that Dilger paper, so probably be a good idea to read it, if not just for your own interest. Okay, so antagonistic to beta 1 and beta 2. So beta 1 receptors are found at higher concentrations in the heart. Beta 2 receptors are found in higher concentrations in the trachea, bronchi. Ractopamine and zilpaterol, when they're fed to cattle, increase heart rate. Okay. At least some of the improvement in performance is going to be explained by increasing heart rate, increasing lung function, increasing oxygen content in the blood, which is going to lead to some of that increase in performance. So by blocking beta 1 receptors, heart rate does not appear to be increased when feeding lubabergon. The effects that it's going to have on the beta 2 receptors are really kind of unknown. Okay. Beta 3 subreceptors have lower expression in adipose tissue than beta 1 and beta 2. Okay. So greater content of beta 1 and beta 2 receptors in adipose tissue increase lipolytic effects of ractopamine and zilpaterol. Lubabergon does not appear to have much, if any, lipolytic effects. So you can see this figure dosing lubabergon or ractopamine in the rumen or the abomasum, and then blood NEFA, so non-esterified fatty acid, so free fatty acid in the blood, indicating lipolytic effects. So you see an increase by ractopamine, no real change in lubabergon. Okay. So beta 3 receptors do not internalize in the cell when they're bound to. Okay. So beta ligands are hydrophilic, so they will not pass through the lipid bilayer of cells. Okay. So when the receptor is internalized, that beta agonist can't bind to that receptor and cause effects. So that's likely why zilpaterol and ractopamine appear to have a desensitization period. So the longer you feed it, the less effective it's going to be. Okay. Also why the FDA has suggested a shorter range of feeding it, because it's only effective for a shorter period of time. Okay. Lubabergon does not cause beta 3 receptors to internalize into the cell, so it does not appear to lead to desensitization, which is why the FDA has approved it to be fed up to 91 days. All right. Make sense? Okay. Optiflex versus Actigain, this study by Quinn. The results are pretty identical, which makes sense because they're the same active ingredient. Okay. Both, you can see this percent difference column is the average of Actigain and Optiflex over the control. Okay. Let you guys look at that later. 4 minutes. So can you stack technologies with beta agonists, huh? Is it 1050? Yeah. Okay, we'll run through this then. God, I thought it was 1040. Someone has got to tell me this every day. Okay. All right. So final body weight was improved by 1.5% by feeding ractopamine. Average daily gain was improved by 15% over the period that it was fed, not over the whole finishing period. That'd be ridiculous. Okay. Feed to gain was reduced by 14.5 or 14.7%. Hot carcass weight was reduced by or increased by 8 pounds or 2%. Dressing percent was increased by 0.5%. Marbling score was reduced by 2%. And the percent of animals that graded choice or better were reduced by 5%. Pretty similar to the summarized table there, right? Make sense? Okay, so can you stack technologies with beta agonists? Okay, so Baxa in 2010 conducted a 2x2 factorial where they fed cattle with and without Revlor S and with and without Zilmax. Okay, they detected no interaction indicating that the two factors did not influence each other. The response was consistent whether the response to Zilmax was consistent whether the implant was used or not. The benefits of implants were there whether Zilmax was fed or not. Okay. So this is the table for the data for each of these specific treatments. Okay. So Revlor S response increased final body weight by 30 pounds. Okay. Increased average daily gain by 0.3 pounds. This is over the control treatment, no Zilmax, no implant. Reduced feed to gain by 0.3 pounds. Increased hot carcass weight by 23 pounds. Increased dressing percent by 0.3 pounds. Reduced marbling score by 16 marbling score units. Okay. Zilmax response increased 23 pounds of body weight, increased average daily gain by 0.2 pounds, reduced dry matter intake by 0.2 pounds, reduced feed to gain by 0.3 pounds, increased hot carcass weight by 46 pounds. Okay. So this response in body weight's different than the summarized table I gave, but we still had double the amount of hot carcass weight produced. Increased dressing percent by 2.4% units, right? That's crazy. And reduced marbling score by 30 units. So the combined effect is literally just the additive of these two. So using Zilmax and Rev-S, increased final body weight by 54 pounds, increased hot carcass weight by 70 pounds. It's crazy. So if you're a natural operation, how much premium would you need by feeding cattle naturally, not using growth promotants, to cover this lost increase in hot carcass weight? It's a lot, and it's not even close to what the premiums we're seeing in the market today. Not to mention the train wreck that occurs by not being able to feed them an insulin. Okay. All right. Experior versus Optiflex. So this McAtee paper, guys out of Kansas State. There are also some Elanco people on it, so keep that in mind. They're both marketed by Elanco, but I think it's kind of appears that they wanted Experior to look better, so they fed Optiflex for less than what would be typical. So they fed Optiflex for 28 days at 300 milligrams per head per day. They fed Experior the last 53 days at 36 milligrams per head per day. Okay. So lubabragon, as my previous summarized table, appears to be a more potent beta ligand than ractopamine. So, but how would these differences look like if they fed Optiflex for another 7 days? I don't know. Okay, so Experior increased final body weight over Optiflex by 1.3%, so 19 pounds. Okay. Increased average daily gain by, 14 pounds. Reduced dry matter intake. Improved feed to gain by a lot. Added 25 pounds of hot carcass weight on top of Optiflex, which is crazy. They didn't have a true control in this study. And had a bigger impact on dressing percent, lower marbling score, less animals that graded choice or better. Okay. So they conducted an economic analysis comparing Experior versus Optiflex. Okay. So you can see this is the dollars per animal enrolled in the study. This is your feed and yardage cost. So this divided by total pounds gained is your cost of gain. So Experior was $1.25. Optiflex was $1.33. Okay. So this is total cost for the animals. This is the revenue on a live basis, revenue on a dressed or in the beef basis. Net return was almost $60 more by feeding Experior over feeding Optiflex. Okay. Net return on a carcass basis, again, was almost $60 greater. They actually lost money if they sold them in the beef in this scenario. Okay. So quick math using the table numbers, and I called a buddy and asked him what it costs for these additives. You can't just look at these prices online. Okay. So Actigain 45, so that's the generic ractopamine hydrochloride, costs $123,800 per ton. Okay. So this is 45.4 grams of ractopamine hydrochloride per pound. Okay. So that's going to cost around 41 cents per head per day if we're feeding it 300 milligrams per head per day. Okay. So Actigain 45, let's say we're going to feed it for the last 30 days on feed. That's going to cost per head $12.30. Okay. But ractopamines adds 16 pounds of hot carcass weight. Let's just assume $3 per pound of hot carcass weight. I didn't look up a price just for the scenario. So that returned $48 to the operation as opposed to not feeding it. So 48 minus 12, 30, that'd be a net advantage of $35.70. Make sense? Per head. Okay. Lubabergon, so Experior 10 costs $90,874 per ton. Okay. So Experior 10 is 1% Lubabergon fumarate. That'd be around 36 cents per head per day if we're feeding it at 36 milligrams per head. So Experior 10 feeding for 40 days is going to cost you $18.40 per head. Lubabergon adds 29 pounds of hot carcass weight at $3 a pound. That's going to return $87 per head to your operation as opposed to not using it. Okay. 87 minus 18 is 68, $60 net advantage of not feeding the beta agonist. Okay. 68.60 minus 35.70 would tell you the advantage of Experior over Actigain or Optiflex. What do you think people are feeding in the real world today? Experior. There are a few people still holding out. Most people are switching to Experior. Okay, from what I'm hearing. So they're not feeding it because it reduces ammonia emissions. Okay. Yeah, thought that was cool. All right, I'm done, guys. Yep.
So how they buy the commercial products in return, sorry, in the range, in the feedlots, or they buy this already included in a meat?
Yeah, so smaller feed yards will add it in what's called an ad pack. Okay, so they'll have some kind of carrier with so much of the active ingredient per pound. Then they'll add that. They'll have one common supplement that they're feeding to their whole feed yard, right? And then they'll add an ad pack with beta agonists and probably MGA, okay, if they're feeding heifers, or beta agonists without MGA if they're feeding steers, okay? And they're just adding that to the mixer on a per load basis, okay? Talking with my consultant buddy, if you take the cost of the drug and add about 25%, that's what it's going to cost you as the producer to buy that ad pack with the drug in it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Larger feed yards with more quantity storage will have a different supplement with different drugs in it. That makes sense? One advantage of AdPack, though, is you can change the amount of that active drug that you're giving over the feeding period so that you're still at each level of dry matter intake. As dry matter intake increases, you can really dial into a certain milligrams per head per day, right? So I'm going to try to work out some examples and cover that AdPack versus formulating a premix in lab. So come to lab.